Night settles over the southern Levant like a dark cloth, drawn slowly across hills, valleys, coastlands, and old roads. The day's heat loosens from the limestone ridges. Wind moves through olive leaves, far below in the lowlands. The last light catches on fields of barley and emmer, on mud brick walls, on the pale dust of roads used by traders, messengers, soldiers, shepherds, and people whose names are mostly gone. A fire burns inside a gatehouse, somewhere near the coast. A ship rests in a harbour after crossing the eastern Mediterranean with jars, timber, metal, oil, and rumours from faraway courts. Inland, on the mound of a city built over the ruins of older cities, a guard looks south toward Egypt, north toward Syria, west toward the sea, and east toward the desert tracts. He does not stand in a forgotten backwater. He stands in Canaan, one of the most watched, crossed, argued over, and remembered landscapes of the ancient world. Long before later generations called parts of this region the Holy Land, long before scribes shaped sacred histories around patriarchs, kings, prophets, conquest, exile, and covenant, this place already has a deep memory of its own. Its cities rise and fall, its temples fill with offerings, its farms depend on winter rain, its ports face Cyprus and the Aegean, its local rulers write anxious messages to greater kings. Its potters press wet clay into jars that travel farther than the people who made them. Its dead are placed with vessels, ornaments, food, and imported objects that hint at alliances, ambitions, and beliefs. Its scribes and artisans experiment with signs that will eventually help change the history of writing. Canaan is not waiting silently for later stories to begin. It is already a world, crowded with voices, and most of those voices survive only as fragments. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not a simple tale of one people appearing, fighting, and disappearing. It is slower than that, and stranger. It is the story of a land that becomes famous through later texts, yet whose earlier life has to be recovered from ruined walls, broken pottery, charred seeds, tombs, seals, imported bowls, temple courtyards, and the occasional line of writing left behind by someone who never imagined that, 3,000 years later, a stranger would try to read it. To understand Canaan before the Bible, the first thing to see is its position. Geography gives this world its power and its danger. Canaan lies along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where the sea meets a narrow strip of coastal plain, where low hills climb toward inland highlands, where valleys open into corridors of movement, and where dry zones press in from the south and east. It is not a vast empire with endless river plains like Egypt. It is not a great alluvial heartland like southern Mesopotamia. It is a smaller, more broken landscape, stitched together by roads and watersheds, by harvests and herds, by fortified towns and local loyalties. Yet that very narrowness makes it important. Whoever moves between Africa and Asia must reckon with it. Whoever sends armies from Egypt towards Syria must pass through or around it. Whoever trades between inland kingdoms and Mediterranean ports can hardly ignore it. From the south comes Egypt, ancient, wealthy, and intensely organized around the Nile. For Egyptian kings, Canaan can be a buffer, a road, a source of tribute, a zone of garrisons, timber, wine, oil, labour, and political pressure. Egyptian influence does not always look the same. Sometimes it is direct and heavy, marked by officials, forts, scarabs, Egyptian-style objects, and imperial demands. Sometimes it is more distant, carried by diplomacy, gifts, prestige, and the desire of local elites to look connected to the most powerful court in the region. Egypt looks north and sees Canaan not as a single nation, but as a cluster of towns, rulers, roads, and resources that must be managed, persuaded, watched, or punished. From the north and northeast come the worlds of Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia kingdoms, merchants, scribal traditions, weapons, myths, luxury goods, and political shocks. A change in northern Syria can ripple through Canaan. A war between great powers can unsettle local rulers who have no wish to be crushed between them. A new trade route can enrich a port or leave another city poorer. Ideas move with goods. So do artistic styles, religious images, measuring systems, prestige objects, and forms of administration. Canaanite cities are never isolated clay islands in an empty land. They are nodes in a network, and that network reaches much farther than the horizon seen from any city wall. To the west lies the sea, and the sea is not a barrier. It is a road with waves on it. From Canaan's coast, sailors and traders look towards Cyprus, the Aegean, Anatolia, and Egypt. Ships carry copper, pottery, timber, resins, textiles, wine, oil, ivory, and objects made to impress people who live in palaces. Some cargoes are practical, others are statements of rank. A jar can be evidence of appetite, exchange, taxation, ritual, or fashion. A small imported bowl in a tomb may speak of distant connections more quietly than a royal inscription, but sometimes with greater intimacy. What survives in the record suggests that coastal Canaan was deeply entangled with the late Bronze Age world of exchange, diplomacy, and elite display, though the evidence remains incomplete and uneven, as archaeology always is. To the east and south stretch drier zones, steppe, desert margins, and routes used by pastoral groups, caravans, and travellers who know how to move where city people may feel exposed. These landscapes matter because Canaan is not only cities and palaces, it is also sheep and goats, seasonal movement, borderlands, wells, tracks, and people whose lives leave fewer monumental traces. The city may preserve its story in walls and tablets, but the countryside holds the rhythm that keeps the city alive. Grain must be grown, olive trees must be tended, vines must be pruned, animals must be moved through landscapes that change with the season. In years of good rain, storage rooms fill. In difficult years, the margins become sharper, and political loyalties may become brittle. This is why the land feels so layered. A city like Megiddo is not merely a point on a map. It overlooks routes through the Jezreel Valley, a place where armies, merchants, farmers, and officials have reason to pass. Hazor controls northern connections and becomes one of the great urban centres of the region. Lachish, in the Shephelah, stands among roads and fields and later becomes famous for destruction, writing, and imperial violence. Though its Bronze Age life is older and more complex than any single catastrophe, Gezer sits near routes between coast and interior. Jericho, with its long deep past, reminds us that the land's human story reaches far before the Bronze Age city-state world. Yavneh-Yam, on the coast, opens toward maritime exchange and toward the presence of elites who live and die within the orbit of Egyptian power. Each site is a doorway, but none is the whole house. Canaan itself is a name that shifts depending on who uses it, when, and why. ancient outsiders use labels for lands and peoples that do not always match how local communities understand themselves. Later traditions compress centuries of social change into clearer moral and ethnic categories. Modern readers often inherit those categories without noticing the compression. But the archaeological Canaan is not one tidy kingdom with one capital, one flag, one ethnicity, or one unified religion. It is a cultural and geographic field, a mosaic of communities linked by language family, material culture, trade, ritual forms, and shared participation in the wider Bronze Age world. Scholars still debate the edges of that identity, because ancient identity is not something found whole in the ground like a sealed jar. It has to be inferred from patterns, and patterns can be real without being simple. The mystery, then, is not whether Canaan existed. It certainly did. The mystery is how to hear it before later memory speaks over it. The Bible will make Canaan unforgettable, but it will also frame it through the concerns of later writers, theologians, kings, exiles, and communities trying to explain who they are. Archaeology asks a different kind of question. What did this land look like before those stories became scripture? What did Canaan mean to the people who built its walls? Buried their dead, traded through its ports, carved its stones, poured liquid offerings, worked its fields, and scratched early letters onto pottery. No single explanation fully accounts for this world, because Canaan was never only one thing. It was a crossroads, a prize, a homeland, a corridor, a marketplace, a sacred landscape, and a place where ordinary people lived under the long shadow of powers larger than themselves. As the night deepens over the imagined Bronze Age hills, the land does not look like a blank stage awaiting history. It looks restless, inhabited, and awake. Egypt watches from the south. Northern kingdoms press and trade from beyond the mountains. The sea brings gifts and dangers. The fields hold the fragile promise of the next harvest. Beneath later names and later memories, Canaan waits in layers, not lost exactly, but buried under the weight of everything that came after. The later name Holy Land carries a weight that Bronze Age farmers, sailors, potters, and city rulers would not have recognized in the same way. They knew fields, wells, shrines, hills, ports, rulers, debts, harvests, family tombs, and the demands of stronger kingdoms. They knew the danger of a failed rainy season, the prestige of an imported vessel, the anxiety of a messenger arriving from a palace, the sound of animals outside a city gate, and the smell of smoke from ovens before dawn. What later becomes holy geography is, for them, lived geography. It is not yet a map of sacred memory. It is a working land, a risky land, a land of border negotiations, kinship, taxation, feasting, worship, and survival. This distinction matters because Canaan is one of those ancient places where later stories became so powerful that they can make the earlier world harder to see. The Bible preserves some of the most influential memories ever attached to the region, and those memories shaped Judaism, Christianity, Islam, literature, politics, art, and the imagination of entire civilizations. But the Canaan of archaeology is not identical to the Canaan of later theological storytelling. The two overlap, sometimes in suggestive ways, sometimes in uncomfortable ways, but they are not the same kind of evidence. One is a set of texts produced, edited, transmitted, and interpreted across long periods. The other is an uneven archive of dirt, bone, ash, pottery, architecture, seeds, tools, inscriptions, and ruined spaces. Both can matter, but they do not speak with the same voice. The biblical Canaanites often appear as the people already living in the land before Israel's rise, and in many passages they are remembered through the lens of conflict, danger, temptation, religious rivalry, or moral warning. That lens became familiar because the texts became familiar. For centuries, many readers first encountered the Canaanites as opponents in someone else's origin story. The name itself came wrapped in judgment. Yet no people lives only as an obstacle in another people's memory. Before they are turned into a category in later literature, the Canaanites are families, towns, lineages, rulers, farmers, metalworkers, sailors, ritual specialists, merchants, scribes, and mourners. They do not wake in the morning thinking of themselves as background figures in a future book. They live at the centre of their own world. Archaeology begins by trying to restore that centre, even if only partially. It asks what can be known before interpretation hardens into inherited certainty. It looks beneath later layers and finds Bronze Age streets under Iron Age walls, old temples beneath later sacred places, storage jars beneath collapsed buildings, local pottery beside Egyptian objects, and tombs that preserve the gestures of burial long after the names of the dead have vanished. At a site like Lachish, the ground does not yield one story but many a late Bronze Age Canaanite city, later Judahite levels, imperial destruction, rebuilding, memory, and excavation. A mound like Megiddo is not one city but a stack of cities, each generation building over another, as if the land itself keeps rewriting the same sentence in clay, stone, ash, and dust. This is one reason the word tell matters. Many ancient cities in the Levant were built and rebuilt in the same places for centuries or even millennia. Mud brick collapses, floors rise, walls are repaired. A house becomes debris. Debris becomes a platform. A new house stands above it. Over time, the settlement becomes an artificial mound, a tell, a hill made out of human persistence. From a distance it may look like a natural rise in the landscape. Up close, it is compressed time. Every layer is a decision, a disaster, a repair, a change in taste, a shift in power. To dig into such a mound is to move backward through lives that were not arranged for modern curiosity. The evidence remains incomplete because most of the past was never meant to last. Later, religious memory often prefers clear beginnings and meaningful endings. Archaeology usually offers continuities, interruptions, and awkward overlap. It shows that identities form slowly, customs shift, populations mix, local traditions survive under new names, old shrines are reused, pottery styles change before languages do, or languages shift while cooking habits remain stubbornly familiar. The world before the Bible is not a neat preface waiting for the first page. It is a long human landscape from which later biblical Israel emerges, partly in contrast to its surroundings, partly through inheritance from them, and partly through transformations that scholars still debate. The question is not whether early Israel had a relationship with Canaanite culture. The deeper question is how close, how varied, how gradual, and how remembered that relationship was. This is where the older habit of treating Canaan only as a defeated civilization becomes misleading. Some cities were destroyed, some political systems collapsed, some elite cultures changed beyond recognition. But Canaan did not simply vanish in a single clean moment. The people of the land did not evaporate when a later narrative needed a new age to begin. Many communities continued. Some were absorbed into new identities. Some became part of the worlds later called Israelite, Phoenician. Aramean, Philistine, or other regional cultures. Along the coast, the people later known as Phoenicians preserve a language and cultural inheritance closely related to Canaanite traditions. Though not every Canaanite is Phoenician, and not every inland village becomes a seafaring city, what survives in the record suggests transformation more than disappearance. The surprise is that this transformation can be seen in very small things. A cooking pot changes shape. A house plan becomes more common in the highlands. Pig bones become rarer in some settlements and remain present in others. Certain burial customs fade. New styles of storage jars appear. A name in an inscription hints at a language that is both familiar and distant. A deity worshipped in one city may echo in the literature of another. A temple model made of clay suggests that sacred architecture could be imagined, miniaturized, and offered outside the most formal spaces of power. These are not dramatic clues in the way a burning palace is dramatic, but they are often more revealing. They show how culture survives not only in monuments but in habits. The Bible, for all its power, is not a field notebook from the Bronze Age. It contains memories, traditions, theology, law, poetry, genealogy, political reflection, and sacred interpretation. Some memories may preserve echoes of older realities. Others may reshape the past to answer questions that mattered much later. Archaeology does not have to treat these texts as worthless, but neither can it simply read them backward into the Bronze Age as if every description were a direct photograph. The ground asks for patience. It asks that the Canaanites be seen first in their own setting, not as symbols, not as villains, not as a vanished race, but as inhabitants of a deeply connected Levantine world. That world is already old before the most familiar biblical stories take literary shape. Its towns have histories of their own. Its rulers negotiate with Egypt. Its artisans make objects for ritual, farming, trade, and display. Its ports look outward across the sea. Its religious life is not a single system but a shifting landscape of local temples, household gestures, feasts, divine names, and sacred performances. Its language belongs to the Northwest Semitic family, close enough to later Hebrew and Phoenician that the relationships can be felt in names and inscriptions, yet the evidence remains fragmentary. In that closeness lies part of the difficulty. The Canaanites are not entirely other. They are too near, too entangled, too deeply woven into what follows. So the shadow of the Bible must be handled carefully. It should not be ignored, because without later biblical memory, Canaan would not occupy the same place in the modern imagination. But it should not be allowed to flatten the centuries that came before. The Canaanites before the Bible are not a footnote to someone else's destiny. They are the builders of cities, the keepers of fields, the makers of jars, the mourners in rock-cut tombs, the sailors watching stars over the eastern Mediterranean, the scribes testing early letters on fragile surfaces, and the ordinary people whose world becomes famous only after much of it is gone. Once the later shadow is set aside, the land begins to speak through mounds. They rise gently from fields and valleys, sometimes so quietly that a traveller could pass them without realizing that the hill itself is made of human time. A tell is not a natural mountain. It is a city that has lived too long in one place. Houses collapse, and people build over them. A wall falls, and another wall takes its place. A gate is burned, a floor is swept, a room is abandoned. A courtyard fills with broken jars, and then a new generation levels the debris and begins again. Century after century the ground climbs upward. What looks like a simple rise in the landscape becomes a layered archive, holding meals, fear, trade, worship, death, rebuilding. and the slow stubbornness of people who keep returning to the same strategic places. Canaan is a land of such mounds. They stand near springs, roads, valleys, ports, and defensible ridges. Because ancient cities are rarely placed at random, a city needs water, fields, access, visibility, and protection. It also needs meaning. Once a place has ancestors beneath it, once a temple has stood there, once a gate has seen generations of traders and officials pass through, it becomes difficult to leave. Even destruction does not always end a city. Sometimes destruction makes the next city easier to build, because broken mud brick becomes fill, fallen stones become foundations, and memory itself becomes a reason to stay. In this way, Canaanite cities are not single events. They are long negotiations between geography and human persistence. Hazor, in the north, gives a sense of scale. In the 2nd millennium BC, it becomes one of the great urban centres of the region, large enough to impress even from the perspective of a world accustomed to fortified towns. It sits where northern roots matter, where connections to Syria and beyond can be felt, and where a local ruler can look outward into a wider political universe. Hazor is not merely a settlement of houses, it is a city of gates, public buildings, temples, elite compounds, storage, craft, administration, and controlled movement. Its ruins remind us that some Canaanite city-states could be powerful in their own right, even when they lived under the pressure of greater kingdoms. The evidence suggests ambition, hierarchy, and organized labor, though scholars still debate how power was distributed inside such cities and how much control rulers truly had over the countryside around them. Megiddo, farther south in the Jezreel Valley, is another kind of ancient magnet. Its position is almost too good to be ignored. Roads converge around it. Valleys open below it. Anyone thinking about movement between Egypt, the coast, the inland highlands, and northern lands has reason to care about Megiddo. That is why the mound becomes so rich in layered history. One age builds above another, each leaving behind walls, stables or storage areas, gates, temples, palaces, and traces of a city that repeatedly matters to people far beyond its immediate fields. Yet beneath the later fame of Megiddo lies a slower world, farmers pressing grapes, artisans shaping vessels, priests or ritual specialists handling offerings, and households living within sight of monumental spaces they may rarely enter. The Great Mound is political and sacred, but it is also domestic, agricultural, and deeply ordinary. Nearby landscapes add quieter clues. Around Tel Megiddo, recent discoveries of an ancient winepress and late Bronze Age ritual objects help make the Canaanite world feel less like a map and more like a lived economy of smell, taste, touch, and ceremony. Wine is not just a drink, it is agriculture, labor, storage, feasting, trade, offering, and status. A vessel shaped like a ram, used for pouring liquid in ritual, does not explain an entire religion by itself, but it brings us close to gesture. The tilt of a hand, the slow flow of wine, oil, milk, or another valued liquid, the belief that something unseen can be honored through material action. What survives in the record suggests that major temples were not the only spaces where religion happened. Some offerings may have been made outside formal sanctuaries, at thresholds, near city edges, or in smaller ritual settings that leave only modest traces. Lachish, in the Shephelah, offers a different kind of power. It stands between the coastal plain and the hill country, in a zone where roots, agriculture, and defense all matter. Later history makes Lachish famous for siege and destruction, but its Bronze Age identity is just as important. It was a Canaanite city before it became a symbol in later conflicts. Its layers hold the evidence of local life under changing regional pressures. At Lachish, one can imagine a city deeply aware of larger forces Egypt to the south, rival towns nearby, shifting trade, and the uneasy politics of the late Bronze Age, a fragment of writing on a jar, especially from the last centuries of the Bronze Age, becomes powerful precisely because it is so small. It does not tell a grand royal story. It may preserve a personal name, a mark of ownership, administration, or memory. The voice is tiny, but in a world where most voices disappear, tiny can be enormous. Gezer sits near routes that link the coastal plain with the interior. Like other tells, it reveals the practical intelligence of settlement. Control a route, and a city can control movement, taxation, communication, and exchange. But control is never absolute. A road brings wealth and danger in the same dust. Traders may bring copper, pottery, textiles, or news. Soldiers may come the same way. Messengers may carry orders that alter the fate of a ruler who has never seen the court that commands him. The city gate becomes the hinge of public life. Where goods enter, disputes may be handled, elders or officials may gather, and strangers are watched. In the archaeology of a gate, the ancient city becomes visible not as an abstraction but as a managed threshold between inside and outside. Tel Shimron, rising in the Jezreel Valley, adds another layer to the picture of Canaanite urbanism. Excavations there have revealed a fortified city with monumental architecture and evidence of long occupation during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. It is one more reminder that Canaan was not defined only by the famous names. Many city-states and towns formed a dense political landscape, each with its own local ambitions and vulnerabilities. A monumental structure at such a site is more than an impressive pile of stone and earth. It signals organized labor, planning, authority, and perhaps the desire of local elites to make power physically visible. Yet even here, certainty has limits. A huge structure can show that a community mobilized resources, but it does not always tell us exactly what people thought it meant. To the north, Ugarit complicates the map beautifully. It lies beyond the strict southern Levantine heartland often meant by Canaan, on the Syrian coast, but its language, texts, gods, trade connections, and cultural world illuminate Canaanite traditions in ways few other places can. At Ugarit, tablets preserve myths, rituals, administrative records, letters, and evidence of a literate elite deeply connected to the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Through Ugarit, gods known across the northwest Semitic world become more audible: El, Baal, Anat, Asherah, and others. The text cannot simply be copied onto every Canaanite village to the south, because religion and culture varied by place, but they reveal a family resemblance, a shared atmosphere of divine kingship, storm, sea, fertility, conflict, feasting, and cosmic order that helps give texture to the otherwise silent temples and figurines of Canaan. The most important thing these cities teach is that Canaan was not empty before later history arrived. It was already thick with institutions, habits, rivalries, and local identities. Its city-states were small compared with Egypt or Mesopotamia, but small does not mean simple. A small city can have diplomacy, taxation, craft specialization, ritual calendars, class divisions, imported luxury goods, and a ruler terrified of losing favor with a greater king. A small city can also contain 1,000 private worlds that archaeology only barely touches a mother grinding grain. A potter judging clay by feel, a farmer watching clouds over the hills, a sailor listening for wind, a scribe choosing a sign, a mourner placing a vessel beside the dead. Across Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, Gezer, Shimron, Ugarit, and many lesser-known mounds, Canaan appears as a landscape of layers rather than a single civilization with one clean outline. Its cities do not all rise together, prosper together, or fall together. Some flourish while others weaken. Some burn and are rebuilt. Some shrink. Some change names. Some become absorbed into later cultures. The tell preserves this unevenness better than any tidy story can. Standing on such a mound at dusk, one is not standing on ruins alone. One is standing on repeated attempts to make a life durable in a land where every road leads somewhere powerful, and every wall is built with the knowledge that history may come through the gate. To ask who the Canaanites were is to step into one of the most tempting traps in ancient history. Modern minds often want an ancient people to behave like a modern nation, with borders, a capital, and a fixed identity. Canaan does not work that way. It is better understood as a landscape of related communities, a cultural zone stretched across the southern Levant and connected to neighbouring worlds by trade, language, politics, and ancestry. The people later called Canaanites did not necessarily wake under one collective label. A ruler may think first of Hazor, Lachish, Megiddo, or another city. A farmer may think first of his household, his fields, his patron, his village, his local gods, and the next season's rain. A sailor on the coast may belong to a maritime town whose horizon feels more Mediterranean than inland. The larger name gathers them together from the outside, from texts, archaeology, later memory, and patterns that are real but never perfectly neat. This is why Canaan is not one nation hiding behind many ruins. It is a shared world. Its people speak languages or dialects belonging to the Northwest Semitic family, close to what later appears in Hebrew, Phoenician, Moabite, and other related tongues. A word may travel farther than a family. A god's name may be known in many towns while rituals differ from place to place. A jar style may spread across regions without proving that everyone who used it thought of themselves as the same people. Archaeology works through such patterns, and patterns are powerful, but they must be handled carefully. Scholars still debate where Canaan begins and ends in different centuries, because ancient cultural boundaries were often soft, overlapping, and political rather than sharply ethnic. The physical ancestry of the Canaanite world also resists simple storytelling. Ancient DNA from Bronze Age sites in the southern Levant suggests continuity with earlier local Neolithic populations, mixed over time with ancestry related to regions such as the Zagros and Caucasus. This does not mean a single invading people swept in and replaced everyone, nor does it mean nothing changed. It points instead to a long process of movement, intermarriage, local persistence, and social transformation. The population history of Canaan is like its tells layered. Some roots go deep into the land, some strands arrive through wider networks of migration and exchange. Over generations, they become part of the same local world. What survives in the genetic record suggests mixture and continuity together, which is less dramatic than an invasion story but far more human. Even this evidence must be treated with caution. DNA can reveal biological relationships, but it cannot tell us exactly what someone believed, what language they spoke at home, which ruler they feared, or how they named themselves in private. A person's ancestry and a person's identity are not the same thing. Ancient lives are lived through family, status, craft, loyalty, ritual, and memory as much as descent. A newcomer's grandchildren may become fully local. An elite family may adopt foreign styles to display power, while ordinary households continue old habits. No single explanation fully accounts for identity in Canaan, because identity itself was not a single thing. The city-state system makes this even clearer. Canaanite political life was fragmented. There was no single king of all Canaan sitting in a capital city and commanding the whole land. Instead, power was distributed among local rulers whose authority was tied to specific towns and their surrounding territories. These rulers could compete, cooperate, petition Egypt, betray neighbours, marry into useful families, and present themselves as loyal dependents when empire loomed overhead. Their world was political, but not national in the modern sense. A city-state could be proud, anxious, wealthy, vulnerable, and deeply local. Its ruler might use the language of submission when writing to a greater king, then press his advantage against a nearby rival as soon as the opportunity appeared. For ordinary people, this political fragmentation mattered in practical ways. Taxes, labour obligations, protection, storage, access to fields, and road safety could depend on which city controlled the area. A farmer living near one town might owe grain or service to one local authority, while relatives in another valley lived under a different ruler. A craft specialist might make goods for temple, palace, market, and household use, moving between local and elite economies. A trader might cross several political territories in a journey that, on a modern map, looks short. Canaan was small compared with great empires, but within it the local differences could be sharp. Hills, valleys, coasts, and plains-shaped lives differently, and the people of those zones did not all experience Canaan in the same way. The coastal communities had their own rhythm. Ports looked outward, receiving goods and fashions from Cyprus, Egypt, the Aegean, and northern Syria. Inland cities watched roads, valleys, and agricultural territories. Highland villages lived closer to rain-fed farming and pastoral movement. Borderland groups may have shifted between settled and mobile ways of life depending on season, pressure, and opportunity. These differences do not divide the land into completely separate civilizations, but they remind us that the Canaanite world was plural from the beginning. It was held together by overlapping language, material culture, religious vocabulary, political relationships, and exchange, not by a single uniform identity stamped equally on every town. One lesser-known but important detail is that the word Canaanite could mean different things depending on context. In some ancient settings, it may refer to a land or people of the Levant. In later usage, related words can be associated with merchants, perhaps because coastal Levantine trade became so prominent. This does not mean every Canaanite was a merchant, any more than every Egyptian was a scribe or every Mesopotamian was a priest. It shows how outsiders often name people by the features they notice most. A society known along trade routes may be reduced to traders. One remembered through religious conflict may be reduced to enemies. Both reductions hide the wider life beneath. The relationship between Canaanites and Phoenicians is another place where careful language matters. The Phoenicians of the Iron Age, especially along the northern Levantine coast, can be understood as heirs to Canaanite language and culture. Cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos carry forward traditions rooted in the Bronze Age Levant. But it is misleading to say that all Canaanites were Phoenicians. Phoenician identity belongs especially to later coastal city-states and their maritime expansion. Canaan is broader, older, and more varied. The Phoenician world is one branch of the larger tree, not the whole forest. The same caution applies to early Israel, Early Israelite culture emerged within a broader Canaanite environment, not in a sealed chamber outside it. Language, settlement patterns, material culture, and religious vocabulary all show connection as well as differentiation. Over time, certain communities develop a distinct identity, and later traditions emphasize separation. But the deeper archaeological picture is one of overlap before difference becomes sharper. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars disagree over details. But the simple picture of two wholly separate peoples facing each other across an absolute boundary does not fit the complexity of the record. So who were the Canaanites? They were not a vanished race with a single face. They were not merely the doomed inhabitants of a promised land in someone else's story. They were a network of Levantine communities, rooted in old local populations and shaped by movement from beyond. Speaking related Semitic languages, living in city-states and villages, farming hills and plains, trading through ports, adapting to imperial pressure, and leaving behind a cultural inheritance that did not disappear when names changed. Their identity was not a wall, it was a web, and like all webs, it is easiest to see when light catches the threads at just the right angle. At ground level, Canaan is not made first of kings, gods, or armies. It is made of work. Before a ruler sends a letter, before a temple receives an offering, before a merchant ship unloads at a harbour, someone rises in the half-light and begins the ordinary labour that keeps the world from coming apart. Grain has to be ground, water has to be carried, animals have to be led out and brought back, clay has to be dug, soaked, shaped, fired, and hoped not to crack. Nets have to be mended. Walls have to be patched after winter rain. Olive trees have to be tended over years before they reward patience. Vines have to be pruned, grapes harvested, jars sealed, floors swept, wool spun, bread baked, and tools sharpened. The Bronze Age street is not silent. It is rough with footsteps, animals, bargaining, smoke, dust, and the repeated sound of hands doing what hands have always done. A Canaanite town is a dense place. Houses press close together, often built of stone foundations and mud brick walls, with roofs that can serve as working spaces during dry weather. Courtyards matter because so much life happens in the open air: cooking, storage, repair, small craft production, social exchange, and the daily movement between household and street. A house is not only a private shelter in the modern sense, it is an economic unit, a place where food is processed, textiles are made, children are cared for in ordinary protective domestic life, family memory is kept, and the household survival is negotiated one season at a time. The evidence remains incomplete, because mud brick melts, wood decays, baskets vanish, and cloth almost never survives. But floors, ovens, grinding stones, storage jars, spindle whirls, loom weights, bones, seeds, and broken tools give back enough to make the ordinary world visible. Food ties the city to the countryside. Canaan's climate is generous in some years and unforgiving in others. The region depends heavily on winter rains. Too little rain means thin harvests. Too much at the wrong time can damage fields, roads, and storage. Farmers grow cereals such as barley and wheat, tend legumes, keep vines and olive trees, and raise sheep, goats, cattle, and other animals depending on environment and wealth. The famous Mediterranean triad of grain, wine, and oil is not just a phrase, it is the slow engine of life. Grain fills stomachs, olive oil feeds lamps, bodies, cooking, perfume, and ritual. Wine moves through feasts, trade, offerings, and status. When archaeology finds presses carved into rock near places such as Megiddo, it shows not merely a technology, but a landscape of seasonal labour grapes gathered under heat, crushed, drained, stored, and transformed into a liquid that can travel socially as well as physically. The work of making tools is equally revealing. A rare intact blade workshop near Nahal Komem, close to modern Kiryat Gat, points to a world of specialized production long before the later biblical framing of the land. Thousands of years ago, skilled knappers shape long, sharp stone blades with a precision that requires training, experience, and controlled technique. These blades are not symbolic luxuries. They are useful things, tied to agriculture, cutting, harvesting, processing, and exchange. The surprising detail is that stone technology remains important even in societies moving toward urban complexity and eventually metal use. Bronze Age life is not a clean replacement of old by new, it is a mixed toolkit. Metal exists and matters, but stone blades can still be efficient, affordable, familiar, and widely needed. What survives in the record suggests an economy where specialists produce tools for households and fields beyond their own immediate circle. Pottery is everywhere because pottery is the ancient world's packaging, tableware, storage system, shipping container, and archaeological memory. A potter understands clay the way a farmer understands soil. Some vessels are plain and practical, made to hold grain, water, oil, wine, or cooked food. Others are more finely finished, slipped, burnished, painted, imported, imitated, or shaped for ritual use. A storage jar in a house may say something about diet and household planning. A jar in a palace storeroom may speak of taxation, administration, or redistribution. A vessel in a tomb may belong to mourning, status, or belief about the dead. A broken sherd with writing on it can suddenly become one of the most intimate objects in the entire city, because it carries a mark of ownership, a name, a number, or a fleeting administrative act. Pottery is humble until it becomes the last surviving witness. The street also belongs to traders. Not all trade is grand maritime exchange. Much of it is local and regional grain moved from field to town, oil from press to storage, wool from flocks to weavers, pottery from workshop to market, tools from specialist to farmer. But Canaan's location means that even ordinary objects can exist within wider systems. Imported Cypriot pottery, Egyptian scarabs, ivory, metal goods, faience, luxury bowls, and foreign-style objects appear in elite contexts, temples, and tombs. Their presence does not mean every household is cosmopolitan, but it does mean the cities are plugged into networks of value. An imported object can carry prestige because of where it came from, who handled it, and who could afford to own it. In a small Canaanite city-state, a foreign vessel on a table or in a tomb may say, quietly, that its owner belongs to a world larger than the valley. The sounds of craft fill the town in ways archaeology can only partly recover. A weaver works with wool or linen, though cloth itself usually disappears. A metal worker handles copper alloys, tools, weapons, ornaments, and repairs. A carpenter shapes wood that will almost never survive unless conditions are unusually kind. A baker tends an oven. A seal cutter carves a tiny object that can carry authority across clay. A bead maker drills through stone, shell, glass, or faience. A scribe, rare compared with the number of farmers and labourers, handles signs that most people may not read but many may recognize as powerful. Writing in such a world is not merely communication, it is administration, ownership, prestige, control, memory, and connection to palace systems. Yet literacy is limited. Most people live in a world where information is spoken, remembered, witnessed, and embodied in objects, not read from a page. Daily life also has a smell. Smoke from hearths lingers in rooms. Animals bring dust and dung near the edges of settlement. Fermenting grapes, stored grain, olive oil, wet clay, leather, fish near the coast, and heated mud brick all belong to the air of Canaan. Ancient cities are not clean stone ruins under museum light. They are noisy, crowded, imperfect, and alive. Streets may be narrow. Drainage is practical rather than elegant. In dry months, dust coats everything. In wet months, pathways turn difficult. A city gate concentrates traffic, gossip, animals, guards, officials, and sellers. Outside the walls, fields begin quickly. The boundary between urban and rural life is not absolute. The town depends on the fields so closely that the harvest is present in every storeroom and every calculation of power. Beneath the visible order, inequality runs through daily life. Some households have better access to goods, storage, animals, land, and protection. Elites live closer to palaces, temples, imported objects, and diplomatic exchange. Workers and farmers carry the weight of production. The city-state's beauty, if it has beauty, rests on labour that is often anonymous. A monumental building at Tel Shimron or a palace at Hazor requires planning and authority, but also bodies moving earth, hauling stone, making bricks, feeding workers, and maintaining systems that do not appear in royal language. Scholars still debate how coercive or cooperative these labour systems were in different places and periods, and the answer likely varies from one city to another. What is clear is that Canaan's impressive ruins were built by many people whose names were never written down. Still, the Bronze Age street should not be imagined only as burden. It is also a place of skill, taste, familiarity, and rhythm. People know the texture of good clay, the look of a healthy vine, the sound of a jar that has fired well, the feel of a blade sharp enough for harvest, the right moment to press olives, the roots where strangers can be trusted, and the local stories attached to a spring, a shrine, or a family tomb. Their world is smaller in some ways than ours, but not simpler. It is intensely known. Every path has memory, every season has risk, every object, from a plain cooking pot to an imported bowl, sits somewhere in a web of work and meaning. Long before later texts turn Canaan into a symbol, its people are living inside a practical, textured, demanding world, where survival depends not on mystery, but on the ancient discipline of doing the necessary things again and again. Religion in Canaan does not begin in silence or in abstract doctrine. It begins with weather, hunger, fertility, fear, gratitude, death, and the hope that unseen powers are listening. A farmer watching clouds gather over the hills is not thinking about theology as a later scholar might define it. He's thinking about rain. A sailor staring westward over the darkening Mediterranean is not arranging the gods into a system. He's thinking about wind, waves, cargo, and safe return. A household placing a small object in a corner, a mourner pouring liquid near a tomb, an elite family sponsoring a feast, a priest tending a temple space, a ruler invoking divine favour before a political decision all belong to a religious world that is practical, sensory, and deeply woven into the ordinary. In Canaan, the sacred is not sealed away from daily life. It touches grain, wine, oil, birth, burial, kingship, illness, storms, and the dangerous abundance of the land. The gods of this world are known imperfectly, because Canaanite religion survives unevenly. Temples survive without sermons, figurines survive without instructions, vessels survive without the hands that used them. Some of the richest written material comes from Ugarit on the Syrian coast, where tablets preserve myths and rituals in a northwest Semitic language closely related to the wider Canaanite world. Through those texts, names become more vivid. El, the high god and patriarchal figure. Baal, associated with storm, power, rain, and kingship. Asherah, linked in many traditions with divine motherhood and sacred presence. Anat, fierce and complex. Yam, the sea. Mot, death. Yet scholars still debate how directly Ugaritic texts should be applied to every Canaanite city farther south. Ugarit is a window, not a mirror. It shows a family of ideas, divine names, and poetic imagination, but local practice in Lachish, Megiddo, Hazor, or a small village shrine may have varied in ways the tablets cannot fully reveal. Still, the broad atmosphere is clear enough to feel. This is a world where storm matters because rain matters. The eastern Mediterranean climate makes divine weather more than symbolism. Without rain, fields fail. Without fields, storage empties. Without storage, rulers lose power and households lose security. A storm god is not an ornamental figure in such a landscape. He stands near the boundary between order and hunger. The thunder over hills is not merely sound. It can become a sign of life returning. In later memories, Baal often appears as one of the great divine names associated with Canaanite religion, and this makes sense in a land where the yearly cycle of dry heat and winter rain governs survival. No single explanation fully accounts for every ritual gesture, but the connection between environment and divine imagination is difficult to miss. Temples in Canaanite cities give the sacred a built form. Some are large and public, tied to elites, offerings, feasting, and civic identity. Others are smaller, less formal, or harder to classify. A temple is not only a place of prayer, it can be a storehouse, a ritual theatre, an economic centre, a place where power and piety meet. The architecture may include courtyards, altars, standing stones, benches, offering tables, cult vessels, and spaces that guide movement from outer access toward more restricted areas. But the stones do not explain themselves. Archaeologists can identify installations, deposits, animal bones, vessels, figurines, and traces of burning. But the meaning of each act often remains partly hidden. What survives in the record suggests a religion of offerings, feasts, libations, divine images, sacred spaces, and repeated gestures, rather than a single fixed creed written for everyone to follow. Recent ritual finds near Tel Megiddo bring this world unusually close. A late Bronze Age votive set, including a vessel shaped like a ram and a small ceramic temple model, suggests ritual activity in which liquids such as wine, oil, milk, or another valued substance may have been poured as offerings. The ram-shaped vessel is especially powerful as an image because it turns belief into motion. It is not just an object to look at. It is an object designed to be handled, filled, tilted, and emptied. The liquid passes through a shaped body, and in that action the human and divine worlds are brought into contact. The small temple model adds another layer. It may represent sacred architecture in miniature. perhaps allowing someone to dedicate an image of a shrine when access to a major temple was limited, or to make a more portable expression of devotion. The evidence remains incomplete, but the scene it suggests is intimate. A person or group standing outside the grand center of power, using clay, liquid, and gesture to reach toward the unseen. Ritual also belongs to the dead. At Yavneh-Yam, a monumental late Bronze Age burial complex near an Amarna Age port, reveals how death could become an occasion for display, memory, and connection to wider imperial networks. A rock-cut tomb, imported objects, feasting traces, and carefully arranged goods show that elite burial was not only disposal of a body, it was a social event, a statement of status, and likely a religious act. The dead remained part of the living community's obligations and imagination. A funerary feast may have gathered people around food, vessels, and memory, creating a moment where family, rank, grief, and sacred expectation came together. Such burials also show how Canaanite elites could participate in Egyptian-influenced systems of prestige without becoming simply Egyptian. They adopted, adapted, displayed, and localized. Their tombs speak in more than one cultural accent. Household religion is harder to see but impossible to ignore. Most people probably did not spend their lives in large temples. Their sacred world may have been closer to the hearth, the storeroom, the courtyard, the family tomb, the doorway, the small figurine, the protective amulet, the seasonal offering, or the spoken blessing that leaves no archaeological trace. Female figurines, animal-shaped vessels, miniature shrines, scarabs, beads, and small cultic objects suggest a religious life that reached into homes and bodies, not just public ceremonies. Interpreting these objects is difficult. A figurine might relate to fertility, protection, devotion, identity, or something more mundane in a specific context. Modern certainty can easily outrun ancient evidence. But the repeated presence of small ritual objects reminds us that the sacred was not only managed by kings and priests, it was also held in hands. Canaanite religion was also not sealed off from neighboring cultures. Egyptian motifs appear in art and objects. Mesopotamian and Syrian influences circulate through myths, diplomacy, and prestige goods. Local gods may be linked, compared, or reimagined under pressure from empire and exchange. This does not mean Canaanite religion was derivative or confused. Ancient religions often absorbed and reworked ideas because gods, symbols, and rituals moved with people. A scarab in a Canaanite context can be an Egyptian object, a local amulet, an elite fashion statement, or a combination of all three. A temple may display foreign influence while serving local needs. The ancient world did not draw hard lines between cultural borrowing and authenticity in the way modern categories sometimes demand. What makes this religious world so compelling is its nearness and distance at the same time. We can recognize the human needs behind it: rain, food, protection, healing, fertility, safe travel, honored ancestors, political legitimacy, and hope in the face of death. Yet the specific meanings often remain just beyond reach. We see the ram vessel, but not the words spoken while it poured. We see the temple model, but not the face of the person who offered it. We see the tomb feast, but not the remembered names around it. We see divine names in texts, but not the full emotional life those names carried in a village after drought or in a port before departure. The gods of storm and sea still stand over Canaan, but they stand behind broken pottery, tablets, bones, and walls, speaking in fragments through a land where belief was as practical as bread and as mysterious as the first thunder after months of dust. Writing enters the Canaanite world quietly, not as a sudden miracle, but as a set of marks made by people who need to remember, own, count, dedicate, command, or be recognized. Most of life still happens without written words. A farmer does not need an inscription to know when the barley is ready. A potter does not need a tablet to judge whether clay has the right temper. A family does not need an alphabet to remember the place of a tomb. But in palaces, storehouses, temples, workshops, and networks of exchange, writing begins to gather power. It fixes a name where a voice would vanish. It marks a jar as belonging to someone or something. It makes a transaction travel beyond the moment when witnesses stood together. It allows orders from distant courts to arrive in visible form. In a world of fragile alliances and layered authority, a sign scratched, painted, impressed, or pressed into clay can carry more weight than its size suggests. Canaan sits at an extraordinary crossroads of scripts. To the south is Egypt, with hieroglyphs carved in stone, painted on walls, and adapted into practical cursive forms for administration. To the northeast and north are scribal cultures shaped by cuneiform, the wedgemark writing of Mesopotamia and Syria, pressed into tablets and taught through formal scribal training. Across the coast, traders and elites encounter other systems of marks, seals, and symbols. Canaanite scribes and administrators do not live in a single script world. They live among overlapping habits of writing, each with its own prestige and purpose. An Egyptian scarab can carry royal and protective meaning. A cuneiform tablet can belong to diplomacy and learned administration. A seal impression can authenticate goods or authority. An early alphabetic sign can look humble beside older monumental scripts, yet it points toward one of the most influential transformations in human communication. The older writing systems are powerful but demanding. Egyptian and cuneiform traditions require specialized training, long lists of signs, and access to institutions that can sustain scribes. Writing in such systems often belongs to palaces, temples, and educated elites. This is not a world where most people read casually. Literacy is narrow, valuable, and socially marked. A scribe is a specialist, a person who can turn speech, numbers, names, and obligations into durable signs. But somewhere in the wider Egyptian Levantine contact zone, a radical simplification begins to take shape: the alphabetic principle. The idea that signs can represent sounds in a much smaller set. The earliest alphabetic experiments are debated in their details, and scholars still argue over dates, places, and routes of development. But the broad importance is clear. Out of the meeting of Egyptian signs, Semitic language, practical need, and local invention, a new way of writing slowly emerges. This early alphabet is not born polished. It is uneven, experimental, and often difficult to read. The signs may be scratched crudely into stone, painted on pottery, carved into objects, or left in contexts that give only partial clues. Some inscriptions are so brief that a whole scholarly argument may rest on a handful of letters. A line may be a name, a label, a dedication, or something more obscure. A sign may be damaged, reversed, or written in a way that does not fit later standardized alphabets. The evidence remains incomplete, which is exactly why each new inscription matters so much. The alphabet did not arrive all at once as a finished gift. It developed through human use, through mistakes, borrowing, local habits, and the repeated need to make language visible with fewer signs than the great scripts of older empires required. Lachish becomes especially important in this story because it has yielded several key pieces of early alphabetic evidence from the southern Levant. The city, already part of the Canaanite urban world, gives us not only walls and destruction layers but traces of writing that bring us near individual names and administrative acts. A recent Late Bronze Age jar inscription from Tel Lachish, written in red ink on a pottery fragment and found in the context of the 12th century BC, may preserve the personal name Bilshalt in a linear Canaanite script. It is a small thing, not a royal chronicle, not a myth, not a treaty, not a law code. Yet that is what makes it haunting. A name on a jar can feel almost accidental, as if a hand reached out from the end of the Bronze Age and left behind just enough for us to know that writing was more active, more local, and perhaps more developed than older pictures allowed. The name itself carries a world. The element Baal, familiar from Canaanite religion, appears in many names across the northwest Semitic world, not always as a formal theological statement in the way modern readers might imagine, but as part of a naming environment where divine elements, hopes, loyalties, and inherited formulas mingle. A person's name can preserve religious vocabulary without explaining the person's private belief. It can indicate family tradition, cultural belonging, or simply the common language of the time. This is one reason short inscriptions are both precious and frustrating. They illuminate the edge of a life, not the whole life. They show that someone had a name, that someone wrote or commissioned writing, that a jar mattered enough to mark, and that Canaanite script continued to be used in a world already under stress. They do not tell us everything we want to know. At Ugarit, writing becomes much louder. There, on the Syrian coast, scribes use cuneiform not only for administration but also for an alphabetic script written with wedge-shaped signs. Ugaritic texts preserve myths, rituals, letters, inventories, and learned traditions with a richness almost unmatched elsewhere in the Canaanite-related world. Through them, the divine and literary atmosphere of the Late Bronze Age Levant becomes audible storm gods, sea, death, kingship, feasting, conflict, and cosmic order. Yet even Ugarit warns against overconfidence. It is better documented than many southern Canaanite cities precisely because its tablets survived. But survival is not the same as representativeness. We know Ugarit so well because of accident, destruction, and preservation. Other cities may have had stories, songs, and archives that simply did not survive. Writing also works through seals. A seal is small enough to hold in the hand, but powerful enough to stand for a person, office, or institution. Pressed into clay, it can close a container, mark a document, secure a storeroom, or advertise identity. Seals often carry images as well as signs, animals, gods, symbols of status, motifs borrowed or adapted from Egypt and Mesopotamia. In a world where many people cannot read long texts, images and impressions carry authority. The seal says that someone with recognized power has touched this object, authorized this transaction, or claimed this material. It is bureaucracy in miniature, but also art in miniature. A tiny carved object can reveal political hierarchy, trade, aesthetic taste, foreign influence, and the human desire to make authority portable. The alphabet's later importance can make its early Canaanite phase seem inevitable, as though these early signs were destined from the beginning to become Phoenician, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and the scripts that shape much of the modern world. But nothing was inevitable to the people making marks on jars and stones. They were solving local problems, using available symbols, naming possessions, recording offerings, handling goods, and working within the pressures of palaces, trade, and memory. Only from a great distance does the path look like a road. Up close, it is a set of footprints crossing mud, some preserved, many erased. Before scripture becomes scripture, before sacred texts define how later generations remember Canaan, writing is already alive in the land in scattered and varied ways. It belongs to diplomacy in cuneiform, to Egyptian prestige and administration, to seals and ownership marks, to early alphabetic experiments, to divine names, personal names, and fragile labels on pottery. It does not yet belong equally to everyone, and most ordinary Canaanites still vanish without leaving a written word. But the few words that remain change the silence. They tell us that Canaan was not only a place remembered by others, it was also a place where people began, in their own brief ways, to write themselves into history. Egypt's presence in Canaan is not always visible as an army on the road. Sometimes it appears as a scarab in a tomb, a painted object in a palace, a foreign-style vessel on a table, a small garrison near a strategic point, a messenger carrying orders, or a local ruler addressing the Egyptian king with the anxious humility expected of a dependent. Empire does not have to stand everywhere at once to be felt everywhere. It can live in the imagination of local elites, in the fear of punishment, in the prestige of imported styles, in the obligation to send tribute, and in the knowledge that the great kingdom to the south has long arms. For Canaanite city-states, Egypt is not merely a neighbour, it is a horizon of power. From the Egyptian point of view, Canaan matters because it sits on the road to Asia. The Nile Valley is wealthy, organised, and self-confident, but it cannot ignore the lands beyond Sinai. Timber, metals, resins, oils, wine, livestock, labour, and prestige goods move through or from the Levant. Military campaigns into Syria-Palestine require routes, water, storage, and friendly or obedient towns. A hostile Canaan can threaten Egyptian ambitions northward. A compliant Canaan can become a buffer, supply zone, and corridor. So Egyptian kings look at the land not as a single people, but as a chain of places to be controlled ports, roads, city rulers, strongholds, and valleys. The map of empire is practical before it is poetic. This control changes across time. During parts of the Late Bronze Age, especially after Egypt's expansion into the Levant, many Canaanite city-states live within the Egyptian imperial sphere. This does not mean every town becomes Egyptian in daily life. Local kings or mayors still rule their cities. Local languages continue. Local gods remain. Farmers still plant according to rain, not according to the Nile flood. Potters still make Canaanite forms. Yet above the local world there is another layer: Egyptian overlordship, tribute, diplomacy, military intervention, prestige, and surveillance. A ruler in Canaan may sit in his own palace, but he knows another palace, far away, can decide whether he is useful, disloyal, replaceable, or doomed. The Amarna letters reveal this atmosphere with unusual force. Written mostly in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age, these tablets preserve messages sent to the Egyptian court by rulers across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, including local leaders in Canaan. Their words are formal, repetitive, and often desperate. They complain about enemies, ask for archers, accuse rivals, insist on loyalty, beg for attention, and describe a political landscape where small rulers try to survive under a great king who is both powerful and distant, even allowing for exaggeration, formula, and self-interest, the emotional climate is unmistakable. Canaan's city rulers are not independent kings in a peaceful network. They are local power brokers under pressure, trying to use Egypt against each other while fearing that Egypt may ignore them. There is a strange intimacy in those letters. A ruler may describe himself as falling at the pharaoh's feet again and again, not because he is literally doing so, but because the language of submission has become the grammar of imperial politics. Beneath that ceremonial humility lies strategy. A local ruler knows that if he can persuade Egypt that his rival is dangerous, disloyal, or connected to unrest, he may gain advantage. Another ruler may use the same language against him. Empire encourages this kind of political theatre. It rewards loyalty, but loyalty is difficult to verify from far away. So the letters become performances of obedience, fear, and accusation. What survives in the record suggests a world where local conflicts and imperial expectations are tangled so tightly that one cannot be understood without the other. Egyptian power also appears in material culture. Scarabs, Egyptian-style amulets, pottery, administrative objects, artistic motifs, and prestige goods appear in Canaanite contexts. Sometimes these objects may belong to actual Egyptian officials or soldiers. Sometimes they may be local imitations or objects adopted by Canaanite elites to signal status. This distinction matters. An Egyptian-looking item in Canaan does not automatically mean an Egyptian person stood there. Objects travel. Styles travel, and power often becomes fashionable. A Canaanite elite may use Egyptian symbols because they carry authority, protection, beauty, or political meaning. Empire can colonize taste as well as territory. At Yavneh-Yam, on the coast, the world of Canaan under Egypt's eye becomes almost cinematic. A monumental late Bronze Age burial complex, cut into sandstone near an Amarna Age port, reveals an elite community deeply involved in the prestige networks of the period. The tomb's architecture, goods, and evidence of funerary feasting suggest a family or group that could marshal wealth, labour, imported objects, and ritual display. This is not a poor provincial margin. It is a coastal Canaanite society participating in a wider imperial and maritime world. The dead are honoured with a complexity that speaks of rank, memory, and connection. Yet the tomb is not simply Egyptian. It is Canaanite in a world where Egyptian power shapes aspiration, where local elites express themselves through a blended vocabulary of burial, feasting, and imported prestige. Such evidence complicates older pictures of empire as only domination from above. Domination certainly exists. Egypt can demand tribute, punish rebellion, install garrisons, control routes, and intervene militarily. But imperial influence also works through desire. Local elites may want Egyptian objects because they signal access to a larger world. They may use Egyptian motifs in tombs and palaces, not only because they are forced to, but because such symbols help them speak the language of status. Canaanite rulers are not passive shadows. They adapt, negotiate, imitate, resist, and exploit imperial structures where they can. The evidence remains incomplete, but the picture is not one of simple replacement. It is a layered relationship in which local and imperial forms coexist uneasily. For ordinary people, Egypt's presence may be more indirect but still real. Tribute demanded from a city ultimately comes from fields, flocks, workshops, and storage rooms. A ruler's obligation to send goods southward can become pressure on farmers and artisans. A military road may bring protection in one season and requisition in another. A garrison may mean order, opportunity, resentment, or all three. Imported goods may be visible only to elites, but the systems that bring those goods are supported by labor across the land. In this way, empire touches even those who never meet an Egyptian official. It enters through taxation, storage, movement, and the constant need of local rulers to prove their usefulness. Egyptian control is also never as complete as official language may pretend. The land is too varied, the city-states too competitive, the roads too exposed, the imperial centre too far away. A town can be loyal in its letters and opportunistic in practice. A local dispute can become a regional crisis if Egypt fails to respond. Groups outside the city-state system can move through the margins and unsettle the plans of palace rulers. The great empire may claim order, but on the ground, Canaan remains restless. No single explanation fully accounts for how Egyptian rule functioned in every town, because imperial power is always stronger in some places than others. A port, a road junction, and a remote village do not experience empire in the same way. The result is a Canaan that lives in two scales at once. On one scale, the farmer watches rain, the potter watches clay, the family watches storage jars, and the local priest watches the offerings. On another scale, rulers watch Pharaoh, diplomats watch rival cities, and elites watch the styles and signals that connect them to distant courts. This double vision gives late Bronze Age Canaan much of its tension. It is local and international, familiar and foreign, dependent and proud. Egypt's shadow falls across the land, but beneath that shadow, Canaanite life continues in its own language, its own streets, its own rituals, and its own stubborn habits. Empire may frame the age, but it does not erase the people living inside it. The sea west of Canaan is never empty. At dawn it may look calm, a sheet of blue light stretching towards Cyprus and the Aegean, but for the people of the late Bronze Age it is a moving road, a dangerous road, and one of the reasons Canaan matters far beyond its size. Ships do not erase distance, but they change what distance means. A harbour town can receive objects made hundreds of miles away, hear news from foreign courts, and send its own jars, timber, oil, textiles, resins, and skilled products into a world of exchange that binds palaces, temples, merchants, sailors, and rulers together. The sea is not separate from the city gate. It reaches inland through traders, taxes, storage rooms, luxury tastes, and the quiet prestige of things that have crossed water. Canaanite coastal life belongs to the eastern Mediterranean world. Ports such as Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Akko, Dor, Ashkelon, and others stand in different periods as thresholds between land and sea, though their importance rises and falls across centuries. Some are more famous in later Phoenician history, but their roots reach into the older Bronze Age Levantine world. Along the coast, a person's horizon is different from that of a farmer in the hills. The sea brings fish, salt air, sailors, foreign jars, unusual stones, new styles, risk and opportunity. A storm can take a cargo and a crew. A favourable wind can bring copper from Cyprus, fine pottery from the Aegean, or messages from courts that most inland villagers will never see. The Mediterranean is both a gift and a threat, and Canaan's coast learns to live with both. Trade in this world is not modern commerce in the simple sense. It is not only buying and selling in open markets. Much of the long-distance exchange of the Bronze Age is tied to palaces, rulers, elite gift-giving, diplomatic relationships, tribute, and controlled movement of high-value goods. A king sends gifts to another king and calls them friendship. A dependent ruler sends goods and calls them loyalty. A merchant moves cargo and depends on protection, credit, language skills, and trust. A temple receives offerings that may include imported materials. A palace stores jars not just because people need food, but because storage is power. The same object can be commodity, gift, tax, offering, inheritance, and symbol, depending on whose hands hold it. Copper is among the great materials of this world. Cyprus, rich in copper resources, becomes central to Bronze Age exchange, and Canaanite ports are well placed to participate in the movement of metal across the eastern Mediterranean. Copper alone is useful, but when alloyed with tin it becomes bronze, the metal that gives the age its name. Tin is more elusive, often travelling from distant and debated sources through long exchange chains. The people using bronze tools and weapons may not know every stage of the journey that brought the materials together. A blade in Canaan may carry within it the hidden geography of mines, ships, caravans, workshops, and political agreements. What survives in the record suggests a metal economy far more interconnected than the map alone would imply. Wine and oil move differently but matter just as deeply. Canaan's vineyards and olive groves turn landscape into liquid wealth. Wine can be consumed locally, offered ritually, served at elite feasts, sent as tribute, or shipped in jars across the sea. Olive oil is food, fuel, medicine, cosmetic, perfume base, ritual substance, and trade good. A sealed jar of oil or wine is an agricultural year made portable. It contains sunlight, labour, storage, land rights, and expectation. When such jars are found far from where they were made, they tell of appetite and exchange, but also of systems that organise production beyond the household. The countryside and the harbour are linked by the jar. Timber carries another kind of value. The Levant is famous in later traditions for cedar and other woods from the northern regions, especially Lebanon, prized by Egypt and other lands where high-quality timber is scarce. Wood rarely survives archaeologically unless conditions are favourable, so its importance can be easy to underestimate. But ancient ships, roofs, doors, furniture, chariots, tools, and luxury objects all depend on wood. A beam may vanish completely, leaving only a socket in stone or a line in a text. Yet whole systems of exchange may have been organized around acquiring it. This is one of the surprises of ancient history. Some of the most important materials are among the least visible in the ground. Luxury goods create another layer of connection. Ivory, glass, faience, carved stone, shells, beads, fine ceramics, gold ornaments, decorated boxes, and imported vessels appear in palaces, temples, and elite burials. These objects are not merely beautiful, they are social instruments. They announce that someone has access to distant networks. They may mark a family as powerful, a ruler as favoured, a tomb as elite, or a ritual as richly supplied. A small imported bowl placed with the dead can say what no inscription says this person belonged, or wanted to belong, to a world of long-distance prestige. At Yavneh-Yam, elite burial near a port makes this especially vivid, because the dead are surrounded not only by local memory but by objects and practices connected to the wider Amarna Age world. The famous shipwrecks of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean help us imagine what did not always reach shore. A cargo ship could carry copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, resin, pottery, weapons, tools, jewellery, and goods from multiple regions at once. Such a ship is not a national container, not Egyptian or Canaanite in a simple way, but a floating knot of international exchange. Its cargo may include objects from Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, Anatolia, the Aegean, and beyond. Even when a wreck is found far from Canaan, it helps explain the kind of world in which Canaanite ports operated. The sea connected courts and workshops in ways no single ruler fully controlled. Inland trade roads are just as important. Goods that arrive at a port do not stay at the shore. They move by donkey caravans, carts where terrain allows, and human labour. Roads cross the coastal plain, climb into the highlands, pass through valleys such as Gezer, and connect to Transjordan, Syria, and Egypt. A city like Megiddo matters not only because it is fortified, but because it watches movement. A place like Gezer matters because coast and interior speak through it. A ruler who controls a route can tax, protect, delay, or profit from the motion of goods. Yet routes are vulnerable. Banditry, rival towns, drought, war, and imperial politics can all disturb them. Trade is not a peaceful layer laid over history. It is part of power itself. Merchants and sailors occupy a fascinating position in this world. They may not be kings, but they carry what kings desire. They know winds, harbours, languages, weights, measures, and the habits of foreign officials. They move between cultures more easily than farmers tied to land. Yet they also depend on protection and patronage. A merchant without trust is only a stranger with goods. A sailor without a harbour is at the mercy of weather. The evidence for their personal lives remains thin, because they rarely leave long autobiographies behind. But every imported object in a Canaanite context hints at people who knew how to move things across political and natural boundaries. Trade also changes imagination. A person in inland Canaan may never see Cyprus, but may see Cypriot pottery. A local elite may never stand in Egypt, but may own an Egyptian-style object. A household may use a vessel shape that began elsewhere and became local through imitation. Foreign things are not always foreign for long. They are adopted, copied, reinterpreted, and made familiar. This is how cultures become layered without losing themselves. Canaan's world is not pure in the sense of being isolated. It is alive because it absorbs, filters, and transforms. Yet the very networks that enrich Canaan also make it vulnerable. A city tied to long-distance exchange benefits from movement, but suffers when movement fails. If copper routes weaken, if palaces lose control, if ships stop coming, if roads become unsafe, if great powers turn inward, the effects reach far beyond royal storerooms. Farmers may still farm, potters may still make jars, families may still gather around ovens. But the elite systems that depend on imported goods and diplomatic exchange begin to tremble. The blue sea gives Canaan a doorway into the wider world, and like every doorway, it can open both to opportunity and to the first drafts of coming trouble. Behind the imported bowls, the carved seals, the fortified gates, and the polished language of diplomacy lies the harder question of power. Canaanite city-states do not float above the land. They are fed by it. A palace may look like the centre of the world from inside its courtyards, but its strength depends on grain measured in storerooms, oil sealed in jars, animals counted, fields worked, labour mobilised, roads watched, and obligations enforced. The ruler's authority is not abstract. It is built from harvests, from land access, from the ability to gather workers, from control over exchange, from alliances with local families, from divine legitimacy, and from the constant negotiation between those who command and those who produce. In Canaan, power is visible in monumental buildings, but it begins in soil. A Canaanite palace is more than a royal residence. It is an administrative machine, a stage for elite display, a storage centre, a place of feasting, a political office, and sometimes a diplomatic theatre where foreign objects help tell local people that their ruler belongs to a larger world. Its rooms can hold jars, records, valuables, weapons, textiles, food, and materials brought in from surrounding villages. The palace consumes, but it also redistributes. It receives grain, wine, oil, animals, metal, labour, and crafted goods, then sends gifts, pays dependents, hosts feasts, supports specialists, and performs authority. What survives in the record suggests that these buildings were not merely impressive homes. They are instruments for turning agricultural surplus into social order. Yet the palace cannot create the harvest. It can demand, measure, store, and display it. But the field remains outside the wall. This is the quiet tension at the heart of Canaanite society. Farmers, herders, orchard keepers, vineyard workers, and village households provide the material base of city life, but they often leave the faintest traces. A ruler's name may appear in a letter, a palace may leave foundations, a temple may preserve ritual vessels. The farmer's work survives as seeds, bones, terraces, sickle blades, grinding stones, storage jars, and wear patterns on tools. The imbalance is misleading. Archaeology often preserves power better than labour, but labour is the larger fact. Without it, no city-state lasts a season. Land is therefore never just land. It is inheritance, livelihood, obligation, status, conflict, and memory. Good agricultural zones near cities such as Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, Gezer, and Shimron are not merely pleasant landscapes. They are the economic heart of local power. A field that produces grain can feed households, support workers, supply temples, fill palatial stores, and satisfy tribute demands from Egypt. An olive grove represents years of investment before it becomes fully productive. A vineyard requires seasonal care and protection. Flocks need grazing and movement. When a city ruler claims authority over surrounding land, he is claiming access to the slow work of many households. No single explanation fully accounts for how landholding worked everywhere in Canaan, because local customs, elite power, family claims, and imperial pressure likely varied by time and place. But the link between land and authority is unavoidable. Storage is one of the clearest signs of this link. Large jars, storerooms, and controlled distribution spaces show that food and liquid wealth could be gathered beyond immediate household needs. Storage turns harvest into power because it allows rulers and institutions to survive gaps between seasons, sponsor feasts, pay labourers, prepare for conflict, and meet obligations to higher powers. A jar of grain is food. A room full of jars is administration. A sealed storeroom is hierarchy made physical. The person who controls access to stored goods controls time itself, because storage is the ability to delay hunger, reward loyalty, and endure uncertainty. In a rain-fed land, that ability matters deeply. Feasting is another form of power, softer than a weapon but often more persuasive. A palace feast or elite gathering can display abundance, create loyalty, mark status, honor gods, receive guests, and transform stored food into political relationship. Wine, meat, oil, bread, imported vessels, music that has left no trace, and ritual gestures may come together in a carefully staged event. Such feasts are not simply celebrations. They are social performances. They tell guests who belongs near the centre and who stands outside it. They turn consumption into memory. The archaeological evidence of feasting can be difficult to interpret. but special vessels, large serving containers, animal bones, and elite architectural contexts suggest that food and drink were often part of how authority became visible. Temples, too, are tied to power. They are sacred spaces, but also economic and social institutions. Offerings require production. Priests or ritual specialists require support. Festivals require food, vessels, animals, wine, oil, textiles, and labor. A temple can legitimate a ruler, protect a city's identity, store valuable goods, and attract offerings from people seeking divine favor. But the religious system does not float free of the economy. Every ritual object has a maker. Every offering has a source. Every feast depends on fields, flocks, and kitchens. The gods of storm and sea may rule the imagination, but their houses are maintained by human hands. Craft specialists occupy a middle space between elite demand and ordinary need. The blade makers at Nahal Komem, potters producing both everyday and special vessels, metal workers shaping tools and prestige objects, seal cutters carving authority into miniature form, textile workers whose products usually vanish, and carpenters whose wood rarely survives all show that Canaanite society depended on trained skill. Some specialists may have worked within palace or temple systems. Others may have served local markets, villages, and households. Their products moved across social levels. A stone blade could serve a farmer. A fine vessel could serve an elite feast. A seal could serve an administrator. A ram-shaped ritual vessel could serve a sacred act. The economy was not divided neatly into sacred, political, and practical spheres. The same networks of skill supported them all. Social hierarchy can also be seen in death. Ordinary burials and elite tombs do not speak with equal volume. A monumental burial complex like the one at Yavneh-Yam shows a world in which some people could be remembered with architectural care, imported goods, feasting, and visible investment. Many others left simpler traces, or none at all. This does not mean the less visible were unloved or unimportant. It means rank shaped the materials that entered the ground and survived for archaeology. The dead of high status could be surrounded by objects that continued to perform prestige after life ended. The dead of humbler households may have been remembered in ways that left fewer durable signs. Here again the record is uneven, and the unevenness itself teaches us about power. Imperial pressure intensifies these internal differences. When Egypt expects tribute, local rulers must draw resources from somewhere. The demands of empire may pass downward through city hierarchies, becoming grain collected from villages, labor assigned to projects, goods diverted toward diplomatic obligations, or pressure placed on households already vulnerable to climate and debt. The palace may appear loyal to Pharaoh while tightening its grip on the countryside. The countryside may appear quiet while absorbing the cost of politics made far away. Scholars still debate the exact mechanisms of tribute and control in different periods, but the broad pattern is clear. International power often rests on local extraction, and yet Canaanite society should not be imagined only as oppression from above. Power depends on consent, custom, kinship, exchange, protection, and belief as well as force. A ruler who cannot protect roads, manage storage, sponsor ritual, or maintain alliances may lose legitimacy. Villages are not powerless in every circumstance. Families have memory, local ties, and strategies of survival. Pastoral groups can move, traders can shift routes, craftspeople can adapt to demand. Even within hierarchy, life is negotiated. Ancient power is rarely total. It is always reaching, always performing, always worried about the next drought, rival, rebellion, or imperial order. So beneath the Canaanite city-state stands a layered society elite displaying imported goods and hosting feasts, administrators sealing jars and counting stores, ritual specialists tending sacred spaces, farmers feeding the city, artisans shaping its material life, traders connecting it to distant markets, and households holding together the daily economy that grand narratives often miss. The palace may crown the mound, but it does not explain the mound alone. The tell rises because thousands of ordinary acts accumulate sewing, grinding, carrying, shaping, storing, repairing, offering, burying, remembering. Power builds upward from these acts, and when the great buildings fall, the dust of those lives remains mixed into the walls. The most haunting voices from late Bronze Age Canaan do not come from kings speaking calmly from secure thrones. They come from rulers who sound worried. They come from men governing small cities under the eye of Egypt, surrounded by rivals, rumors, raiders, shifting loyalties, and the terrifying possibility that the great power they serve may not answer in time. Their letters are formal, repetitive, and full of exaggerated loyalty. But beneath the formula, something raw can still be felt. A city ruler insists he is faithful. Another claims his enemies are lying. One begs for archers. Another warns that a town is nearly lost. They bow in words before Pharaoh, but their real audience is power itself, distant and uncertain. Canaan in these letters is not a peaceful landscape of timeless villages. It is a political chessboard where every local ruler fears being the next piece removed. The Amarna letters are among the most extraordinary archives for this anxious world. Found in Egypt at the site of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital associated with Akhenaten, they preserve diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BC. Many are written in Akkadian cuneiform, the international language of diplomacy, even when sent by rulers whose everyday speech was something else. That alone reveals the layered nature of the age. A Canaanite ruler governs a local city, speaks a northwest Semitic language in ordinary life, worships local gods, negotiates with neighboring towns, and writes to Egypt using the scribal language of a wider diplomatic world. His letter is local fear dressed in international script. The tone of these messages can seem almost theatrical. Local rulers describe themselves as servants, dust beneath Pharaoh's feet, loyal beyond question, obedient in every way. But this humility is not simple honesty. It is political language. Everyone knows how one is supposed to speak to a great king. The repeated phrases are part of the performance. What matters is what each ruler tries to do beneath that performance. He wants troops. He wants recognition. He wants his rival distrusted. He wants Egypt to believe that his city is strategically important. He wants to survive. In these letters, loyalty is not only devotion, it is a tool. This is what makes the archive so revealing. Canaanite rulers do not appear as a united people with a single cause. They appear divided, competitive, nervous, and deeply practical. One city's misfortune can be another city's opportunity. A ruler may accuse his neighbor of rebellion or treachery, perhaps because the accusation is true, perhaps because it is useful, perhaps because both possibilities overlap. Local conflicts become imperial reports. Every dispute is framed in terms of Pharaoh's interest, because that is the language most likely to matter at court. The small politics of Canaan are translated into the vocabulary of empire. The letters also show how fragile Egyptian control could be on the ground. Pharaoh may be addressed as absolute lord, but distance weakens command. Egypt cannot stand physically inside every city gate at every hour. Its power depends on messengers, garrisons, loyal rulers, strategic roads, fear, and reputation. If a local ruler believes help will come, Egyptian authority feels strong. If help does not come, the same authority begins to look like a shadow. The evidence remains incomplete, and the letters must be read carefully because they are not neutral reports. They are pleas, accusations, and arguments. Yet their repeated anxiety suggests a political environment where local rulers were often unsure whether the imperial system could actually protect them. A word often discussed in relation to these letters is habiru or apiru, a term that appears in late Bronze Age text across the region. It does not seem to describe one ethnic group in the modern sense. It may refer to displaced people, outlaws, mercenaries, uprooted groups, dependents, or people living outside normal city-state structures, depending on context. In the letters from Canaan, rulers often invoke such groups as threats to order, though exactly who these people were remains debated. The temptation to connect them too directly with later biblical Hebrews has existed for a long time, but scholars are cautious. Similarity of sound is not enough. What survives in the record suggests a broader social category tied to instability, marginality, and service outside regular structures, not a simple label for one later people. Their appearance in the letters matters because they expose a weakness in the city-state world. Fortified towns and palaces imagine society as something organized around rulers, fields, tribute, temples, and roads. But not everyone fits easily into that model. People displaced by debt, conflict, failed harvests, political pressure, or opportunity can move along the edges. Some may serve rulers as hired fighters, others may threaten caravans or settlements. Some may be used as convenient scapegoats by officials trying to explain losses. The city-state system depends on control, but the landscape is full of people and zones that resist neat control. No single explanation fully accounts for the Habiru, and that uncertainty is part of their importance. They are a reminder that ancient societies always had margins, and margins could become politically dangerous. The Amarna letters also reveal the importance of information. A rumour can be weaponized, a messenger can shape policy, a delayed reply can change the fate of a town. Rulers write because they know that whoever controls the story at court may control the outcome. If Pharaoh believes one city ruler and not another, troops may be sent, favour may shift, and a rival may fall. The letters are therefore not only records of events, they are attempts to create events. A tablet travelling south to Egypt is a political act. It carries a version of reality impressed into clay. Somewhere along the way, dust gathers on it, hands pass it forward, and a local crisis becomes a problem for a distant palace. The physical journey of a letter is worth imagining. A scribe prepares the tablet. The message is shaped in a language and script associated with diplomacy. Perhaps not the spoken language of the ruler dictating it. It is dried, sealed, entrusted, and sent along roads where safety is never guaranteed. The messenger moves through territories controlled by different towns, through Egyptian-administered zones, past garrisons or watch points, across desert edges, and finally toward the Nile world. Weeks may pass. By the time the tablet reaches court, the situation it describes may already have changed. A city that begged for archers may have survived without them, fallen before they could arrive, or exaggerated the danger from the beginning. Ancient communication is durable in clay but slow in time. This slowness gives late Bronze Age politics a particular tension. The ruler of a Canaanite city lives in immediacy, a rival nearby, a threatened road, a shortage of troops, a rumour of rebellion, a demand for tribute. Egypt lives in distance court priorities, imperial strategy, competing concerns, royal ideology, and perhaps limited interest in every local quarrel. Between those two scales, anxiety grows. The local ruler must make the distant king care. That is why the letters repeat loyalty so intensely. They're not only reporting danger, they are saying, again and again, "Do not forget me." Yet for all their worry, the letters also show the sophistication of Canaanite political life. These were not primitive chiefs mumbling at the edge of civilization. They were rulers embedded in an international system, using scribes, diplomatic conventions, accusations, requests, and strategic language. They understood hierarchy. They understood persuasion. They understood the value of presenting themselves as indispensable. Even their fear is politically intelligent. Canaan appears here as a world of small states forced to think in large terms. The anxiety in the letters does not yet mean collapse, but it reveals stress lines. Rivalries sharpen. Marginal groups become more visible. Imperial attention seems inconsistent. Local rulers depend on outside support while competing with one another. Trade, tribute, military protection, and political legitimacy all rely on systems that must keep functioning across distance. If the roads remain safe, if Egypt remains attentive, if harvests remain adequate, if cities can manage their rivalries, the world can continue. But the letters make clear that continuation is not guaranteed. Beneath the formal phrases of obedience, Canaanite rulers are already listening for cracks in the walls. By the end of the Late Bronze Age, Canaan stands close to the edge of a much larger unravelling. The signs do not appear all at once, and they do not mean the same thing in every city. A wall burns in one place while another settlement continues. A palace collapses while a village survives. A trade route falters. But local farmers still plant the next season's grain because the land does not stop needing work simply because kings are afraid. Collapse, when seen from far away, can look like a single dark wave sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean. Seen from inside Canaan, it is more uneven, more local, and more unsettling. It arrives through shortages, rumours, broken alliances, disrupted roads, failed protection, shifting populations, and the slow realization that the great systems holding the age together may no longer be reliable. The wider world is trembling. Great palace societies across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East face crisis in different forms. Mycenaean centres in the Aegean weaken or fall. Hittite power in Anatolia disappears. Cities on the Syrian coast burn. Egyptian influence contracts, and long-distance exchange networks become less stable. Later texts and inscriptions speak of enemies from the sea, of invasions, of upheaval, of battles and emergency. Archaeology adds destruction layers. Abandoned buildings, changes in settlement, altered trade patterns, and signs that elite systems were losing their old coherence. But no single explanation fully accounts for this transformation. The Late Bronze Age world does not fall because of one cause. It is more like a tightly woven fabric pulled from many sides until the threads begin to tear. Canaan is especially vulnerable because so much of its elite life depends on connection. City rulers rely on Egypt's attention, imported prestige goods, controlled roads, tribute systems, diplomatic communication, and the ability to present themselves as local managers of a larger imperial order. A palace filled with foreign objects is impressive when the sea lanes are open and the great powers are stable. It becomes more fragile when ships stop arriving. When copper or tin becomes harder to obtain, when Egypt's authority weakens, when local rivals grow bolder, and when smaller communities realize that the old centers may no longer protect them. The same networks that made Canaan cosmopolitan also expose it to distant shocks. Climate may have played a role, though scholars still debate exactly how large that role was in different regions. Periods of drought or unstable rainfall could strain rain-fed farming, reduce harvests, intensify competition over stored food, and push households, herders, and local rulers into harder choices. In Canaan, where agriculture depends heavily on seasonal rain, even a modest shift can matter. A year of poor rainfall is survivable if storage is good, authority is trusted, and trade remains open. Repeated stress is different. It can weaken confidence in rulers, increase debt, encourage movement from marginal areas, and make city-state politics more volatile. The evidence remains incomplete, and climate alone cannot explain the collapse of palaces and empires. But it may have been one pressure among many, working quietly beneath the more dramatic language of war. War and violence are easier to see archaeologically when they leave burning, broken gates, weaponry, mass destruction, or abrupt abandonment. Several Canaanite cities show evidence of destruction in the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, though the timing, causes, and meaning vary. A burned layer can be tempting because it feels like an answer. Fire seems decisive. It gives the past a dramatic punctuation mark. But fire does not always tell us who set it, why, or what happened after. A city may burn because of invasion, local rebellion, imperial punishment, accident, internal conflict, or some combination of events. Sometimes destruction is followed by rebuilding. Sometimes it marks a permanent change. Sometimes it becomes famous later for reasons that distort its earlier context. Archaeology can show the wound, but not always the hand that made it. The phrase Sea Peoples often appears in discussions of this age, and it has a certain dark gravity. Egyptian records describe groups associated with upheaval, migration, and conflict during the reigns of late New Kingdom pharaohs. Some of these groups may have moved by sea, some by land, some as families or warriors, some as displaced populations, some as confederations formed by the chaos of the time. Yet the label can easily become too simple, as if a single mysterious people emerged from nowhere and destroyed the Bronze Age by themselves. Most scholars are more cautious. The movements of peoples were real and important, but they were part of a wider crisis involving political weakness, economic disruption, environmental stress, warfare, and internal instability. The so-called Sea Peoples are not a magic explanation. They are one visible part of a larger storm. For Canaanite cities under Egyptian influence, the weakening of Egypt's grip changes everything. When the imperial center is strong, local rulers may compete but remain within a framework. They appeal to Pharaoh, they fear garrisons, they send tribute, they borrow prestige from Egyptian symbols. But if Egypt cannot project power with the same force, the framework loosens. Some cities may try to assert more independence, others may be exposed to attack. Rivalries that were once contained may become open. Local elites who built their authority on imperial connection may find that connection less useful. The old language of loyalty begins to sound hollow when the empire no longer answers as before. Trade disruption strikes at the elite heart of Canaanite society. Imported pottery, metals, ivory, luxury goods, and diplomatic gifts are not just decorative. They support the social world of palaces, feasts, tombs, and rulers who display connection. If the flow of such goods declines, elites lose part of the material vocabulary through which they express rank. Craft systems tied to palace demand may suffer. Port communities may adapt, but not without stress. Inland towns that once benefited from routes linking sea and hinterland may see traffic shift or shrink. The collapse of exchange is not only economic, it changes how power looks. Meanwhile, people continue moving. Some may flee ruined towns, some may leave overburdened settlements for smaller villages, some may join mobile groups, some may settle in the highlands, where new patterns of village life begin to appear in the early Iron Age. These movements are difficult to trace in human terms because archaeology records settlement patterns more easily than personal decisions. But the landscape changes. Urban centres weaken in some areas. Smaller settlements grow elsewhere. The balance between city and countryside shifts. What survives in the record suggests not a total emptiness after collapse, but a reorganisation of life. This is the key to understanding Canaan at the edge collapse is not disappearance. The Bronze Age city-state system weakens, burns, fragments, and transforms, but the people of the land do not simply vanish. Farmers still farm where conditions allow. Potters still shape clay, though styles change. Families still bury their dead. Local languages continue to develop. Religious traditions persist, merge, or are reinterpreted. The old palace-centered world loses authority. But underneath it are households, villages, skills, memories, and habits that can survive the fall of kings. The great cities make the loudest noise when they collapse, but quieter forms of life often endure. As the 13th and 12th centuries BC pass into the early Iron Age, Canaan becomes less like the world described in the Amarna letters, and more like the fractured beginning of something new. Egyptian garrisons recede, coastal groups change, highland settlements multiply. New identities sharpen. Old Canaanite traditions continue under altered names and conditions. The age of anxious letters, imperial tribute, and palace diplomacy gives way to a messier regional landscape. It is not the end of human life in Canaan, it is the end of one system's confidence. The walls burn, the roots shift, the royal language fades, and beneath the ash, the next world begins forming before anyone has a name for it. After the burning cities, the land does not become silent. This is one of the most important truths about Canaan, and one of the easiest to miss when history is told only through collapse. A palace burns, and the story seems to end. A gate falls, and a civilization appears to vanish. A layer of ash seals a floor, and the mind imagines the world above it suddenly emptied. But archaeology, when read patiently, tells a slower and less dramatic story. The destruction of a city is not the destruction of every field around it, every household memory, every local craft, every spoken word, every ritual habit, or every family line. The end of the late Bronze Age city-state system is real. The disappearance of Canaanite life is not. In the years after the Great Unravelling, Canaan becomes a landscape of uneven survival. Some old urban centres are damaged or abandoned. Others continue in reduced form. Some places are rebuilt, but not always with the same scale, wealth, or political organisation. The grand architecture of palaces and temples becomes less dominant in many areas. Imported luxury goods become less common. Egyptian objects and administrative signs lose some of their old force as Egypt's presence weakens. The old elite language of Amarna Age diplomacy fades, yet the countryside remains alive. People still need wells, fields, terraces, animals, paths, ovens, storage jars, and tools. The collapse of a royal system does not cancel the next planting season. This is where destruction layers can mislead if they're treated as the whole story. A burned city is dramatic because fire preserves a moment of crisis. Charred beams, collapsed mud brick, smashed vessels, and debris on floors create the impression of suddenness. But what happens after the fire may be more important. Do people return? Do they rebuild the same way? Do they move to nearby villages? Do they abandon the old mound and settle in smaller sites? Do they keep old pottery traditions? Change cooking habits? Or adopt new styles? Do they continue worshipping the same gods under altered conditions? The evidence remains incomplete, and every site must be studied on its own terms. But across the southern Levant the pattern is not one of simple erasure. It is one of fragmentation, adaptation, and reorganization. The old city-state world had depended on hierarchy. Rulers, palaces, temples, tribute, elite feasts, scribes, and international exchange gave late Bronze Age Canaan its familiar political shape. When that system weakens, life does not become primitive, but it does become differently organized. The heavy top of society cracks. Smaller communities matter more. Local production becomes more visible. Some people who once lived under the authority of city rulers may now find themselves in looser arrangements, with less access to palace goods, but perhaps less direct pressure from palace demands. Others may suffer from insecurity, disrupted exchange, and the loss of protection. Collapse is not liberation in any simple sense, and it is not only catastrophe, it is a redistribution of vulnerability. In many areas, the early Iron Age brings new settlement patterns. Villages appear or grow in the highlands. Some are modest, built with local materials, tied to agriculture and herding, and lacking the grand signs of late Bronze Age elite life. Their existence has often been drawn into later debates about early Israel, but before turning to identity, it is worth seeing them first as part of a post-collapse landscape. People are reorganizing where and how they live. Some may be descendants of local Canaanite communities. Some may include groups from the margins of the old city-state system. Some may reflect movement from lowlands to highlands, or the growth of populations that had previously left fewer archaeological traces. Scholars still debate the exact processes, and no single explanation fully accounts for all sites. But the broad shift from palace-centered urbanism toward more dispersed settlement is one of the defining changes of the age. Material culture changes, but it does not become wholly new overnight. Pottery forms evolve. Cooking pots, storage jars, bowls, and household assemblages show both continuity and difference. This is how culture often moves through time, not by vanishing cleanly, but by being reworked through daily use. A potter trained in one tradition may teach another generation that modifies shapes. A family may keep familiar cooking habits while living under a new political name. A community may abandon an elite burial style while maintaining local foodways. Imported objects may decline, but local craft continues. What survives in the record suggests that beneath the political collapse, many practical traditions persist because they are embedded in ordinary life. Religious life likely changes as well, but here the record is especially difficult. Large temples may be destroyed, abandoned, reduced, or transformed. Small shrines, household practices, local cult objects, and offerings may continue in forms harder to detect. Divine names do not disappear simply because a palace falls. Ritual habits can be stubborn, carried in families, seasonal calendars, and local memory. Yet new social conditions can reshape worship, without the same elite sponsorship. Religious life may become less monumental in some places. In others, old sacred sites may be reused. Later religious traditions will remember Canaanite gods in polemical ways, but in the immediate aftermath of collapse, the reality is likely far more gradual old names, old gestures, local shrines, and changing communities overlapping in ways the surviving evidence only partly reveals. The coastal world also changes, though not uniformly. Some ports suffer disruption, others adapt. Maritime exchange never disappears entirely. But the old Late Bronze Age palace network loses coherence. The movement of goods becomes less tied to the same diplomatic world that had once linked Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, Anatolia, Syria, and Canaan. Over time, certain coastal cities will become powerful in new ways, especially in the world later associated with Phoenician expansion. But immediately after the collapse, what matters is that the coast remains open. The sea still lies there, blue and dangerous, offering routes for exchange, migration, raiding, settlement, and reinvention. The end of one Mediterranean system becomes the beginning of another. Egypt's retreat leaves a political vacuum. The old question for Canaanite rulers had been how to survive under Pharaoh's attention. The new question becomes how to survive without it. Some cities may try to maintain local authority, others cannot. Without the imperial framework, rivalries shift. New groups enter or become visible. Older populations reorganize. The land becomes a patchwork of emerging powers rather than a set of small city-states under a single dominant southern empire. This does not mean Egypt vanishes from memory or influence, but the balance changes. Symbols that once carried imperial prestige become relics of an older order. The authority they represented no longer holds the land together. One of the quieter surprises of this period is how much survival can hide behind changed names. Later histories often make new identities seem absolute, as if one people replaces another in a clean sequence. Archaeology is less tidy. The same valley may hold older Canaanite traditions and newer settlement forms. The same language family continues to develop in different directions. The same gods or divine titles may echo across communities that later define themselves against one another. The same families may live through a transition that, in later memory, becomes a boundary between ages. What looks from a distance like disappearance may, up close, be transformation under pressure. So after the burning cities, Canaan is not gone. The Bronze Age version of Canaan, with its palace rulers writing to Egypt, its elite tombs filled with imported goods, its temple economies, its city-state rivalries, and its deep entanglement with imperial diplomacy, is wounded beyond recovery in many places, but the human fabric remains. It stretches, tears, knots, and is rewoven. People move into smaller settlements, rebuild old sites, continue farming, keep speaking related languages, adapt rituals, reshape pottery, and live inside the ruins of a world whose political architecture has failed. The ash marks an ending, but under the ash there are seeds, and in ancient history, seeds are often more powerful than stones. From the broken edges of the Late Bronze Age, new names begin to gather over old landscapes. They do not arrive like labels placed neatly on a clean map. They form slowly, unevenly, and often in places where older Canaanite life has not disappeared at all. In the highlands, small settlements multiply and communities later remembered as Israelite begin to take shape. Along the coast, older Canaanite-speaking cities continue into the world later called Phoenician, turning seafaring, craft, and alphabetic writing into a legacy that will travel far beyond the Levant. To the north and inland, Aramean groups rise into political importance. Nearby, Philistine communities reshape parts of the southern coast. bringing their own material traditions into contact with local ones. The old Canaanite world does not simply end and make room for strangers. It becomes the soil from which several later identities grow, sometimes claiming descent, sometimes denying kinship, sometimes remembering Canaan as home and sometimes as enemy. Early Israel is the most sensitive and most famous part of this transformation, because later biblical memory gives it a powerful narrative shape. In those texts, Israel often appears in contrast to Canaan, as a people called to be distinct from the surrounding inhabitants of the land. That contrast matters for understanding later identity, theology, and memory. But archaeology shows that the earliest Israelite communities emerged within the broader Canaanite cultural world, not outside it in total separation. Their language belongs to the same Northwest Semitic family. Their earliest material culture shares much with local Levantine traditions. Their settlement patterns, foodways, architecture, and household life develop in conversation with the land around them. Scholars still debate the exact mixture of local highland populations, displaced groups, pastoral communities, possible migrants, and social movements that contributed to early Israel. But the older picture of a completely foreign people simply replacing a completely separate Canaanite population does not fit the evidence in a simple way. This does not make early Israel just Canaanite in a flat sense. Identity is not only ancestry or pottery. Communities define themselves through memory, worship, law, food habits, stories, kinship, and boundary making. A group can emerge from a shared cultural environment and still become distinct over time. In fact, that may be the more interesting story. Difference does not always begin with distance. Sometimes it begins with nearness. The need to separate can become stronger precisely because people share language, land, and older traditions. Later Israelite writers often emphasize the danger of Canaanite gods, practices, and influence, and this polemic itself suggests closeness. One does not usually argue so fiercely against a world that has no power of attraction. Religion reveals the entanglement most clearly. Names such as El appear in both Canaanite and Israelite contexts, though they are interpreted differently across time. Divine titles, poetic imagery, sacred mountains, storm language, temple symbolism, and older Near Eastern motifs move through the region in complex ways. Later, Israelite religion eventually develops a distinctive monotheistic identity. But that development is a long historical process, not a switch flipped in a single generation. The evidence remains incomplete, and debates over the earliest phases of Israelite worship are intense. What survives suggests inheritance, reform, rejection, reinterpretation, and memory all happening within the same broad Levantine religious atmosphere. The Canaanite gods did not merely vanish. They became part of the language through which later communities argued about truth, danger, loyalty, and identity. Along the coast, the continuity is even more openly visible. The Phoenicians are often best understood as Iron Age heirs of Canaanite language and urban culture, especially in cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. They do not usually call themselves Phoenicians in the Greek sense. They are people of their cities, sailors of their ports, makers of purple dye, traders, colonizers, artisans, and carriers of writing. Their language is a Canaanite language. Their alphabet develops from earlier Levantine alphabetic traditions and becomes one of the great vehicles through which writing spreads across the Mediterranean. From Phoenician forms come Greek adaptations, and from Greek, eventually, many scripts that shape later Western writing systems. In that sense, one of Canaan's most durable legacies is not a palace, a temple, or a kingdom. It is the shape of letters. This is one of history's quiet ironies. Later memory often treats Canaan as something superseded, condemned, or lost. Yet Canaanite linguistic and scribal inheritance helps make later memory possible. The alphabet, born through long experimentation in the Levantine and Egyptian contact zones and carried forward by Canaanite and Phoenician scribal habits, becomes a technology of remembrance. It allows law, poetry, trade records, dedications, royal inscriptions, and sacred texts to move in new ways. The same region that later literature frames as morally dangerous helps provide the written tools through which later cultures preserve their deepest claims. History has a dry sense of humour when viewed across enough centuries. Phoenician expansion carries the older Canaanite coastal world outward. Ships move west. Trading stations and colonies appear across the Mediterranean, most famously Carthage in North Africa. With them travel language, cults, craft techniques, artistic styles, commercial habits, and alphabetic writing. This does not mean every Phoenician city or colony is simply Bronze Age Canaan repeated abroad. New settings produce new identities. Carthage becomes its own powerful world. Western Mediterranean communities adapt Levantine inheritances to new landscapes, but the thread remains visible. The coast that once connected Canaan to Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean now sends Levantine culture farther west than most Bronze Age city rulers could have imagined. Inland and northward, Aramean groups also reshape the Iron Age Levant. Their language, Aramaic, eventually becomes one of the most important languages of the ancient Near East, used across empires and communities. The rise of Aramean polities shows again that the post-collapse world is not empty or simple. It is a field of new political formations, many of them drawing on older regional traditions while developing identities of their own. The Levant after the Bronze Age is not a clean replacement of Canaan by one successor. It is a crowded transformation, with Israelites, Phoenicians, Arameans, Philistines, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and others forming a dense human landscape of related languages, rival kingdoms, overlapping customs, and competing memories. Memory turns Canaan into more than a place. For some later traditions, it becomes an ancestral landscape. For others, it becomes a warning. In biblical literature, Canaan can appear as inheritance, temptation, promised territory, moral contrast, or the name of a people whose presence raises questions of identity and faithfulness. These meanings are powerful, but they are later meanings. They belong to communities looking backward, explaining themselves, drawing boundaries, and turning the past into a moral map. Archaeology cannot erase that memory, but it can make it deeper and less simple. It can show that the people remembered as Canaanites were not a single shadowy enemy. They were also part of the ancestry, language, economy, and religious background of the very cultures that later remembered them. This is why Canaan is both lost and not lost. The old Bronze Age city-state world is gone. No ruler of Hazor writes again to Pharaoh in Amarna-style diplomacy. No elite family at Yavneh-Yam hosts exactly the same kind of burial feast. No potter at late Bronze Age Lachish paints the same name on a jar with the same expectation of use. But Canaan survives in transformed identities, in coastal cities, in alphabetic scripts, in divine names remembered and rejected, in farming habits, in settlement patterns, in genetic continuity mixed with later movements, and in the deep vocabulary of the Levant. It becomes ancestry and enemy because later peoples are never free from the worlds that made them. They can inherit, deny, reshape, and argue with the past. but they cannot step outside it completely. Beneath the names Israelite, Phoenician, Aramean, and others, the older threads of Canaan remain, sometimes bright, sometimes buried, but still running through the fabric. The lost world of Canaan is not buried in one place. It is scattered across thousands of fragments, each too small to hold the whole story and yet too persistent to ignore. It survives in the slope of a tell at sunset, where a mound that looks like a natural hill is actually a city folded into itself. It survives in a storage jar broken into pieces and carried away in excavation baskets. It survives in a tomb cut into sandstone near the sea, in a ram-shaped vessel made for pouring liquid, in a blade workshop where stone still mattered in a changing economy, in a burnt gate, in a seal impression, in a few letters painted in red ink on pottery. Canaan does not return to us as a single voice. It returns as a murmur from walls, bones, seeds, scripts, and dust. This is why archaeology is so different from legend. Legend can speak clearly, sometimes too clearly. It can give names to heroes and enemies, shape events into moral patterns, and make the past feel finished. Archaeology rarely offers that kind of certainty. It gives instead a floor with grinding stones still resting near an oven, but no explanation from the woman or man who used them. It gives a tomb with vessels and imported objects, but not the private grief of the people who placed them there. It gives an inscription that may preserve a personal name, but not the face, age, household, or full life of the person behind it. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a failure. It is the natural condition of studying lives that were never arranged for our understanding. The tells themselves are the great memory machines of Canaan, Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, Gezer, Shimron, and many others preserve time vertically. To dig them is to pass downward through human persistence an Iron Age wall, a late Bronze Age destruction layer, a Middle Bronze Age fortification, older streets, older floors, older ash, older foundations. Each layer was once the surface of the world. People walked there without knowing they would become a stratum. They repaired walls without knowing those repairs would help date a phase. They threw away broken pottery without knowing that pottery would become one of the most important tools for reconstructing their age. The ordinary acts that seemed disposable became the archive. Pottery remains one of the most patient witnesses. Its value is not only in beauty, though some vessels are beautiful. Its deeper value lies in repetition. Shapes change slowly. Clay recipes vary by region. Imported wares reveal connections. Cooking pots speak of household habits. Storage jars speak of agriculture, taxation, trade, and survival. A single sherd may seem mute, but thousands of sherds together can show a city's place in time, its links to other regions, its economic shifts, and sometimes its collapse. The surprising detail is that broken pottery, the ancient equivalent of discarded packaging and kitchenware, often preserves history better than royal ambition does. Kings wanted to be remembered, but the trash heaps kept the better record. Bones and seeds widen the story beyond elites. Animal bones show diet, herding strategies, trade, ritual feasting, status, and changing habits between communities. Charred grains and olive pits reveal fields, meals, storage, and stress, pollen, phytoliths, and botanical remains hint at landscapes that no longer look the same. Residue analysis can sometimes detect traces of wine, oil, fats, resins, or other substances absorbed into pottery walls. Isotopes in teeth and bones may suggest movement. Diet and environmental conditions. These methods are quiet, technical, and far from the drama of burning cities, but they make the past more human. They ask not only who ruled, but what people ate, where animals grazed, what plants grew, and how bodies lived in the land. Ancient DNA adds another kind of evidence, powerful but easily misunderstood. It shows that Bronze Age people associated with Canaanite material culture were not a pure, isolated population, but a mixture of deep local ancestry and ancestry connected to regions beyond the Levant, with change over time. It also suggests that the people of Canaan did not disappear without biological trace. Later populations in the region carry complex inheritances, layered by many later movements and histories, but not severed completely from the Bronze Age past. This must be said carefully. DNA is not a modern political map, and it should not be forced into modern claims of exclusive ownership. What it can show is more subtle and more important ancient identities were formed through continuity, mixture, and transformation, not through clean beginnings and endings. Language preserves Canaan differently. The Northwest Semitic world echoes through names, divine titles, inscriptions, and later languages such as Hebrew and Phoenician. The early alphabetic experiments of the Levant eventually help shape writing systems far beyond the region. A few letters on a jar from Lachish may look fragile beside a pyramid inscription or a Mesopotamian library, but the tradition behind such letters points toward a revolution in how people record speech, the Canaanite world. Remembered so often through the words of others, also helped give later peoples tools for writing memory itself. That is one of its most enduring legacies, not a monument rising in stone, but signs small enough to travel, adapt, and survive. Religious memory is more difficult, because it is filtered through argument. Later texts remember Canaanite gods with suspicion or hostility, while archaeology reveals a more intimate world of temples, offerings, figurines, libations, feasts, and household gestures. El, Baal, Asherah, Anat, and other divine names belong to a religious atmosphere that influenced, troubled, and surrounded later traditions. Some elements were rejected, others were transformed, others became so deeply absorbed into language and imagery that they are hard to separate. Scholars still debate the exact pathways of religious change, especially in the emergence of early Israelite religion. But the older Canaanite world is clearly part of the background from which later sacred identities formed. And then there is living memory, though it is not simple continuity in the romantic sense. No one today is a Bronze Age Canaanite stepping unchanged out of the past. 3,000 years of empire, migration, conquest, trade, religion, language change, exile, return, settlement, and modern nationhood lie between that world and ours. But the land itself has not stopped remembering. The same valleys still funnel movement. The same coast still faces the Mediterranean. The same hills still catch winter rain. Ancient routes underlie later roads. Old sites become later cities, ruins, shrines, farms, military positions, tourist places, and excavation zones. The landscape is rewritten again and again, but the older text is never fully erased. So Canaan is not best understood as a civilization destroyed and sealed away. It is a civilization dispersed into consequences. It survives in the Phoenician alphabet and in biblical memory, in archaeological museums and excavation trenches, in the names of gods remembered through conflict, in the genetic complexity of later Levantine peoples, in farming traditions tied to the same climate, in ruined city gates, in imported bowls, in burnt mud brick. In the quiet curve of a winepress cut into stone, its political world ended, its city-states changed, its rulers stopped writing to Egypt, its temples fell or were transformed. But the human world beneath those institutions continued to feed what came next. Standing over a Canaanite tell at dusk, the eye sees only earth, grass, stone, and perhaps the line of an excavated wall. But beneath that surface are many Canaans: the farmer's Canaan, the sailor's Canaan, the scribe's Canaan, the mourner's Canaan, the ruler's Canaan, the child safely held within a household's daily care, the artisan's Canaan, the priest's Canaan, the village beyond the palace, the port beyond the field, the name painted on a jar, the body laid in a tomb. The city burned and built again. The world before the Bible is not gone. It is simply no longer whole. It waits in fragments, and the fragments are enough to show that before Canaan became a symbol, it was a place where people lived, worked, worshipped, feared, hoped, and left behind more than silence. In the end, Canaan remains most powerful not because it can be fully recovered, but because it cannot. It stands at the edge of memory, close enough to touch through pottery, tombs, walls, letters, seeds, and bones, yet distant enough that the people themselves keep slipping away. Their cities can be mapped, their tools can be measured, their jars can be classified, their inscriptions can be read. Sometimes their ancestry can be studied through traces left in ancient bodies. But the full warmth of their voices is gone. The small decisions of a household, the private meanings of an offering, the tone of a name spoken in a courtyard at dusk, the thoughts of a sailor looking towards Cyprus, the fear of a ruler waiting for Egypt's reply, the quiet pride of a craftsperson shaping a blade or vessel with practiced hands, these survive only as shadows around evidence. That is the condition of almost all human history. Most people do not leave monuments. Most lives do not become texts. Most worlds vanish not because they were empty, but because they were full of things too ordinary and too fragile to endure. Wood decays, cloth disappears, voices fade, names are forgotten, mud brick returns to earth, a city becomes a mound becomes a hill, grass grows over the place where a gate once stood, and the wind moves across it without explaining anything. Yet disappearance is never the same as nothingness. Canaan changed the world in ways both visible and hidden. It fed later identities, it shaped languages, it carried gods, myths, rituals, and memories into new forms. It helped nurture alphabetic writing, one of the quiet revolutions of human civilization. It remained inside the cultures that rejected it, inherited from it, argued with it, and transformed it. Its people were not frozen in one name. They moved into the future under other names, in other cities with altered customs, carrying older threads into new cloth. So the lost world of ancient Canaan is not simply a vanished enemy, nor a mystery sealed beneath sacred history. It is a reminder that before every famous text, there is a lived landscape. Before every symbol, there are hands. Before every later memory, there are people who did not know they would be remembered at all. The night returns to the Levant. The sea darkens. The hills cool. Somewhere beneath the earth, a broken jar still holds the curve of a forgotten hand, and above it, the old roads lie quiet under the stars.